I think we've got. If you want to, I don't know if you want to like pump the room up a little bit. Tell them it's like maybe a 2 or 3 parter we've got going. The beginning of a bigger story.
Yeah. This what we're working on could go places. I want to like preface with the point of this show is to entertain. We make no representation one way or the other about the truth of anything that you're about to hear. We are amateurs, and we are doing this for fun.
All accurate.
Yeah. So I went down the research rabbit hole on like big public works projects in New England, and the Quabbin Reservoir. It's always caught my eye. It's one of the most interesting stories in our state's history.
It's fascinating. I'm sorry to interrupt, but being not a native and then learning that this giant body of water that feeds this huge metropolis didn't exist 100 years ago. It's a fascinating story.
Yeah, and as like staggering as the scale of the project is, the weirdness around it is even more interesting, and there's so much of it.
Sure.
Yeah. So you wanna get into it?
Yeah, I do.
All right. So I'll start with my notes about the history, just to give anyone who's not familiar with the project a bit of background. The Quabbin Reservoir was built between 1930 and 1939 to serve as the primary watershed for the greater Boston area, whose demand for clean drinking water had outgrown the Wachusett Reservoir, completed back in 1901. Its name comes from the Nipmuc Indian word meaning place of many waters, which had previously been given to a hill and lake in the region. The site of the reservoir was to be the center of the Swift River Valley, where 4 towns would be raised to make way for the enormous public project. Like its predecessor, the Wachusett, the Quabbin had a major advantage built in with its upland location. Its higher elevation meant gravity would carry the water to Boston, avoiding the necessity of a costly pumping system. The residents of Dana, Prescott, Greenwich, and Enfield, Massachusetts fought to keep their land, but the demands of the growing metropolis 65 miles to the east ultimately won. The towns were disincorporated in 1938. Any lands from those towns which would remain above water after the flooding of the reservoir were split among the surrounding towns. A few historic buildings, churches and such, were moved to nearby Belchertown, Petersham, and New Salem. What remains under the reservoir's 412 billion gallons of water is not entirely clear. Access to the public water supply is carefully controlled by the state, and diving is seldom permitted. Some believe whole structures remain in the bed of the reservoir. The Hell Huddle Bridge supposedly emerges from the water when the level is low in the hottest months of the year. Some photos have been taken of views down old submerged roads, signs and foundations of buildings eerily visible on either side. So it's a long, weird story. 4 towns were in the middle of that valley, and they are no longer. Well, I mean, somewhat no longer. There's all sorts of stuff left down there.
Well, I remember years ago listening to, I think it was an NPR story where they interviewed some divers that were, I don't know if the state sends people out regularly to, sample the water or what have you, but they commented that it's almost like walking through a ghost town because there's still foundations of buildings. You can still see streets. And one diver talked about falling into a hole that when he climbed out of, he realized was a grave because they had exhumed all the graves and moved all the people to rebury them.
Yeah. Scary stuff. But yeah, let's see. Yeah, so I mean, like, I'm trying to get to what the Quabbin's been used for more recently, because it gets weirder. So So let's get into the next bit of the next sort of chapter of this story. The Quabbin was sealed off with the completion of the earthen Windsor Dam and Goodnow Dyke in 1939, the former being named for Frank E. Windsor, the MWRA's chief engineer at the time of the construction. The Quabbin Aqueduct, one of the longest in the world, even to this day at 25 miles, was cut from the Quabbin to the Wachusett, repurposing some tunnels from the abandoned Ware River Railway. It allowed excess water from the Quabbin to fill the Wachusett while running a power station in West Boylston. The newly completed reservoir would take 7 years to fill, but from 1941 to 1946, the Army Air Force utilized the unsubmerged reservoir bed as the Quabbin Reservoir precision bombing and gunnery range, dropping hundreds of bombs from planes from the nearby Hanscom and Westover airfields. Today, this area is off limits to the public. The Army Corps of Engineers claims the bombs were filled mostly with sand, with some small amount of black powder to mark their landing sites, though some fear that there are darker secrets hidden at the bottom of the Quabbin. What a brilliant idea to use a public water supply's land to drop precision munitions.
Right, absolutely. Absolutely. And of course they're perfectly safe. There's nothing to be seen.
Nothing to see here. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then even if there is, you just restrict access so no one can, leave, go muck around and check it out.
Yeah, no, there's no diving here. It has nothing to do with the precision munitions at the bottom of the...
Yeah, right.
You just can't.
Well, and I understand a lot of people were really offended when, at least a lot of people in Western Mass, that, they had to give up these towns for the big city folk in Boston. That they they weren't happy that they were picked for that.
I also, I watched a documentary about it too, and a lot of the workers who came to, this whole project took place in the middle of the Great Depression. And a lot of the people who came to work on the project were from the city.
Mm-hmm. So they weren't even really employing local people.
Right. They had been given jobs by, the political elite of Massachusetts.
Yeah. Okay.
So they had a really bad reputation in this area too. They were referred to sort of derogatorily as woodpeckers.
Oh, funny.
Yeah. Yeah. And they caused a lot of trouble. With crime rate increased all around the area.
Right. Stop me if I'm jumping ahead in the story, but because this ties in with some of the research I was doing, you found some interesting astronomical stuff. Is that jumping too far ahead?
No, that's sort of where I'm taking it.
Okay.
Yeah. So the reservoir reaches it's full in 1946, and there's not a lot going on at the Quabbin until around 1969, when the 5 College Radio Astronomy Observatory is built on a peninsula on lands formerly of Prescott, Massachusetts, one of the 4 disincorporated towns. The facility was a collaboration between 5 local universities with federal funding from the NSF. Access to the site, like most of the facilities around the Quabbin, was carefully restricted to the necessary personnel. The FCRAO was originally equipped with a custom low-frequency antenna designed to detect pulsars in the galaxy. Instrumentation developed in the facility at this time would later aid in the discovery of a binary pulsar, which Joseph Taylor and Russell Hulse would receive the Nobel Prize for in physics in 1993. For reasons unclear, though, in 1976, just a few years after FCRAO's founding, the low-frequency antenna was scrapped for a high-frequency dome-enclosed millimeter wave antenna. The 5 colleges which had originally conceptualized, built, and operated the facility also began looking to build a new radio observatory in Mexico. It is unusual that these you know how university funding is, that these universities that put so much effort into building this facility scrapped it and rebuilt it 6 years later, and then began looking for a new facility just a few years after that.
Right.
But considering the climate of the time and where some of the funding for the facility came from, maybe it's not so surprising.
Sure.
While it's never explicitly stated that the government seized control of the facility during the height of the Cold War, the timeline of events and the federal funding through NSF make a compelling case. Pilots flying over the facility sometimes told strange stories of what they saw below. After the 1970s, the facility lay largely abandoned until 2011. The universities looked for a buyer for the telescope, but failed to locate one for reasons unclear. The facility does not remain as a ruin like so many other facilities of its time, nor has it been repurposed for a public observatory or museum. Instead, the facility was painstakingly disassembled and removed, every piece disposed of, and the land carefully graded so that no trace remains of FCRAO today.
I read somewhere, I think they planted a bunch of sugar maples.
That's real weird.
It is weird. If you want to talk about the astronomer, because my stuff picks up with his family in a way I thought was interesting.
Oh yeah, sure. I'm excited to hear that you found out more about him, because he's I sort of dead-ended with him. I reached out to Professor Quentin Stair, former chairman of the facility, with some questions, and he told me a story that only raises more questions. He was tasked with directing the cleanup effort in 2011 inside the facility before it was torn down. The building had long been vacant, the last academic work there having been concluded decades earlier. It was remarkably clean, he said, considering how long it had been. He informs me that the reason the high-frequency device couldn't be sold was that it appeared to have been completely re-engineered. The parabola, the huge functional part of the antenna, had been removed and reinstalled at the top of the dome, effectively inverting the entire device, meaning it would be more effective at detecting signals from underground rather than space, though for what purpose he could not guess. Something about his assertion that he couldn't guess at its function struck me as wrong, like he might be hiding something. But it had been hard to get him to talk at all, so I decided not to press the matter. The telescope was also missing the focal apparatus that would have been installed opposite the parabolic surface, its new configuration implying this piece of equipment had been replaced with something much larger and unusual in shape, which had been removed from the site before his arrival, perhaps just shortly before, considering how little dust had accumulated on anything. He also found a scrap of paper, apparently torn from a yellow notepad that had been left behind with a peculiar message on it. The note read, 816, transmission received, 7FRVK6, 24 hours apart, exclamation point. Possible response from subcraft, question mark, interval unknown, notify the notch. I attempted to call him for a follow-up a few weeks later. Some questions, kind of popped into my head after we talked, and I haven't been able to reach him since.
So, what I find interesting, if you'll indulge me, we're gonna have to kind of walk through a thing here a little bit, but hopefully it'll be worth it. So, Halley's Comet, named after British astronomer Edmund Halley, in the late 1600s, I think it was 1690s, he writes a paper about his theories concerning the Earth being hollow, and which today is laughable, but we're talking, this is 1690s. He bases, it's a logical premise. He says if you're seeing freshwater ice at the poles, that water clearly must come from freshwater rivers pouring out from inside the Earth. Otherwise, how do you get freshwater ice? So this kind of kicks off. He wasn't the first. Obviously, you can go through mythology and, whether it's an underworld or this, that, and the other. But a scientist as eminent as himself, putting forth this hypothesis that the world is hollow, gained some traction and gained some interest. And a lot of people, some quackery, some very sincerely pursue this in various forms. Fast forward a couple centuries later, there's a gentleman named Cyrus Teed, who was from New York. He served in the Civil War as a surgeon, and his experiences in the Civil War led him to reassess his life. And, he felt that while practicing medicine was all well and fine, that there was some greater purpose, that there was, he felt that, called to not just heal people physically, but he wanted to heal them spiritually as well. And so at the time, he went to, interestingly enough, you could go to regular medical school, and then he found a esoteric medical school, which was a thing that existed. It almost sounds like the Hogwarts of medicine or something, where along with more traditional, herbal remedies of the time, you would engage in metaphysical studies, in things that today we would just probably refer to as alchemy. But he took these studies very seriously, and he coupled them with the medical skills, the more conventional medical skills he had already had during his military service. And this combination led him to experiment, and he would experiment with, he liked to experiment with chemicals and high levels of electricity.
That's a hell of a combination.
Yeah, right, with various effects. One day, after electrocuting the fuck out of himself, he comes to having had a vision that gives him purpose, gives him a mission. Right, he sees a path forward where not only is he going to help his patients, but he's going to help all of humanity. And he changes his name from Cyrus to the Persian Koresh. Not to be confused with later David Koresh, but I'm sorry, not Persian. I think it's Hebrew for Cyrus, whatever. And he starts what becomes kind of a religion, right? It's the Koresh Unity is what he calls him, his organization. And their core tenet is this concept of like a cellular microcosm, right? So it's not that the Earth is hollow, it's even better than that. It's hollow in a convex way, meaning that it's not like we're living on the top of a shell and then it's hollow in the middle. It's more like we're on the inside, right, on the shell, and everything in the middle is like the universe, like the sun, the moon, the stars, space, and it's all contained in this cell. Okay.
Wow.
It's
the surface of the Earth, the cell, like the whole surface.
Yes. And the way we perceive like the stars and the planets are all, it kind of throws Newtonian physics and Euclidean geometry like on its head. Like light travel, it's curved, and there's a whole body of what today we would call pseudoscience to like prop this up, right? But he believes very strongly in this, and he's trying to find followers. And at the time, there had been a period after actually before the Civil War called the Great Awakening, where a lot of religious revivalism spread through New England, New York area. And so coming up with a new faith, people were a little tired of that, and they were a little impatient. So he didn't manage to find any followers in New York. So he moves to Chicago. And Chicago was undergoing a bit of a renaissance. This would have been right before the World's Exposition of, I think it was 1893. We talked a little bit about that. Deserves a whole program of its
Oh,
own.
yeah.
But anyway, it was a good time to be in the city. Like, so people from all over the world were converging there. There was, if you had a new faith or anything you wanted to test out, that was the place to go. Like spiritualism, occult practices, any kind of non-normative faith or science or snake oil. If you were selling it, people were buying it. So he sets up his medical practice and manages to convert some followers, and is, slowly growing his organization. But the Chicago press, they're very practical-minded people, and they have very little patience with him and are rather dismissive of him. So he packs up and moves to Florida. Back then, Florida, there was nothing going on. He moved way down by Fort Myers. It was just hot, swampy land. But he was going to build his utopia. And what I found that was...
For once, Florida's like the least weird part of this story.
Yeah, maybe he brought the weird. Maybe he kicked it off. I don't know. But... So, now he has kind of like an official kind of cult. He actually used the word cult in some of his publications. But they clear the land. They set up a publishing house. They set up a bakery. They're doing all these kind of like public works projects. They're like interacting with the locals. They start a political party. And they're really becoming part of the community to the point where, I don't know if you know this, because I know this only because I've been to the museum down there, but like Thomas Edison had a place down there, and he and Henry Ford would visit this, today I guess we'd call it a compound, and listen to this guy's talks. He was very charismatic about this, cellular world that he was describing. But what I noticed that pertained to your story that I thought was most interesting was your professor's grandparents. Grandparents were part of that organization in Florida. So I don't know how steeped he would have been in this kind of worldview of this hollow earth, this convex hollow earth. Yeah. And then when you talk about like this dish being re-aimed towards the ground to try to pick up signals, I wonder if he was trying to, it's conjecture, but pick up on some of the science that they had done almost a century earlier with very exact measurements that they would take, trying to prove that the earth curved and light curved in a way to support their theories. I wonder if in some way, if not directly, if almost spiritually, he was picking up on that research.
Yeah. Wow. What a crazy thing to consider. I have to so looking a little bit as deep into him as I could with like what's available on the internet. He's like a disgraced professor from MIT. I learned that much, and it's clear from what you can read that he was disgraced for, or removed from his department for having espoused views that run contrary to mainstream science.
Sure.
So whether or not we're talking about the same thing, I can't say today, but it certainly bears looking into.
Yeah, no, I think it's, there's enough dots to connect that, there's a story there somewhere. I don't know, to take what I can only imagine. I've seen images of that radio telescope. It almost looks like it's like a little mini Epcot dome, right? It's like a little like a buckyball kind of thing.
Yeah.
To take something that clearly must have cost an obscene amount of money and then erase any presence of it whatsoever, and then set it back up, in Mexico somewhere outside of prying regulatory eyes is somewhat interesting.
It is heavy weird stuff. Like it is like if you whatever was going on there and whoever was part of the goings on, just leaving the facility in a protected area would be less weird than disappearing the facility from the protected area.
Sure.
So yeah, I would give an awful lot to see what was inside that facility before it was torn down.
Well, I guess hopefully if you can hear back from this guy, this professor guy, that might point you in a direction.
Yeah, I'll keep trying. Look into next to kin and such.
Sure. But yeah,
I'm really excited.
That's where we could pick it up next time. We could see how much ground we've covered between today and next week in terms of getting, hopefully getting in touch with someone that has something to say.
Maybe we can do more on the World's Fair just because it's that good. Just because it's that weird.
It is, yeah. I don't know why everyone doesn't know about it. Like all the stuff that came out of it, it's its own separate thing. So, all right,
cool.
Well, I think that kind of brings us almost to a close.
Yeah. Thank you for joining me. Thank you all for joining us. It's been fun. Hopefully we'll see some or all of you next week.
Yeah, we'll go further down the rabbit hole, right?